Rael had not obeyed me in 100 years. He had not obeyed anyone. He walked the inner yard of Veldmore Keep at the hours that suited him, slept where the stone held the most warmth, and regarded the entire pack, from the eldest elder to the youngest page, with a kind of remote indifference, as though they were clouds passing over a mountain that had stood long before they formed, and would stand long after they dissolved. When I called to him, he sometimes turned his great silver-black head toward me. Sometimes he did not. When I gave him a direct command, he listened to the sound of it the way a man listens to wind, with the vague awareness that something is moving nearby, and no particular inclination to do anything about it. The pack had learned not to remark on it. 100 years is long enough for even a custom that ought to be strange to settle into the texture of ordinary life. Rael was Rael. He moved when he chose to move. He came when he chose to come. The only thing any of us knew with certainty was why he had become this way, and none of us spoke of it. My first queen had died in the deep of winter, 100 years ago precisely. Rael had been at her feet. He had not moved from that spot for 6 days, and when he finally rose, he was already the animal I have just described, the one who answered nothing, who was tethered to Veldmore not by loyalty or command, but by some private understanding he kept entirely to himself. I had not tried very hard to change him. There were mornings when I thought I understood exactly what he was doing, because I was doing something similar, in my own way, in my own corridors. This is where the story begins, not with her arrival, but with me standing at the high window of the East Gallery, watching Rael pace the yard in the thin gray light of early winter, as I had watched him on 1,000 mornings before this one. The caravan from the southern passes had come through the gate an hour earlier. I had barely registered it. Caravans came through Veldmore's gate regularly. Merchants, traveling healers, traders in seed grain and salt. My steward, Oren, handled them. I concerned myself with the pack. I was turning away from the window when I noticed Rael stop. He had been moving in his slow, deliberate circuit along the far wall. He stopped as though something had touched him gently between the shoulders. Not a blow, not a stumble, but the hand of someone who meant to get his attention. He turned his great head toward the gate. I followed the line of his gaze. A woman had come through with the caravan, carrying a flat wooden case strapped across her back and a bundle of dried herb branches under one arm. She was looking at the yard with the calm, assessing eyes of someone who wanted to know where the water was, where the sheltered corners were, what direction the wind came from. She was not looking at Rael. Rael took 3 steps toward her and then stopped again, as though reminding himself of something. I stood at the window and watched that for a moment. Then I went back to my correspondence. Her name was Marin. Oren told me this when I asked, which I told myself I asked only because it was my business to know who was sheltering under my roof. She had traveled with a company of herb traders from a valley settlement 4 days south, came as their healer's assistant, stayed when the company moved on because Oren had told her we were short a proper herb keeper for the winter season, and she had looked at the state of our stores and said she would stay. She had said it simply, apparently, without asking what the arrangement might pay. Oren had found this remarkable enough to mention it to me twice. I noted it and returned to other things. She was given a workroom in the east wing near the herb garden, a low-ceilinged stone room with good light and a door that opened directly onto the garden beds, which at this time of year held only the winter-hardy plants, the frost sage, the boneset, the white root that kept through snow. I did not visit the east wing. I had no reason to. Rael did. On the 3rd morning after her arrival, my steward came to me with a look I had not seen on Oren's face before, and Oren had been at Veldmore for 60 of those 100 years, which meant he had seen a great deal and had learned not to be moved by most of it. He stood in the doorway of my study and said, carefully, "My lord, you may wish to come and see something in the east corridor." I walked with him to the east corridor. Rael was sitting outside the herb room door. Not lying down, not pacing. Sitting, upright, still, facing the door with his weight settled back on his haunches and his great head lifted, attentive, as though he had been called to attend something important and was waiting for it to begin. I heard, from inside the room, the sound of something being quietly sorted and rearranged, and then the woman's voice, low and unhurried, saying something to herself, not to us, not to anyone outside. At the sound of her voice, Rael's ears moved. I had not seen his ears move like that in 100 years. Not like that, alert and interested and pointed, the way a young wolf's ears move when it hears the voice of someone who matters to it. I stood in the corridor and looked at my spirit wolf and did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "Rael." He turned his head to look at me. He looked at me for a moment in his usual way, the way he had regarded every command I'd given him for the past century, with the mildly tolerant awareness that I existed and was speaking. Then he turned back toward the door. Oren, beside me, said nothing. This was wisdom on his part. "Come," I said to Rael. Rael did not come. I studied the back of his silver-black head for a moment, and then I turned and walked away, because there was nothing to be done with him when he was like this, and because I was not entirely certain what I would say if I stayed. That warmth had been there again, just for a moment, in the center of my chest. Faint as an ember, I had not felt anything like it in so long that I had almost convinced myself I had forgotten what it was. I did not go looking for her, that is the truth, and I want to be careful to tell this truthfully. What happened was that Rael began to precede me. He was at the herb room each morning when I came through the east corridor, which I began to come through because the east corridor was the most direct route from the great hall to the training yard, which was true, though I had not used that route in some years. He was at the kitchen garden gate each afternoon when she came out to tend what remained in the beds. He appeared at the far end of the long gallery on the evenings when she walked there. It was a habit she had, a slow evening walk through the corridors of the keep, learning the layout of it, I supposed, with the methodical curiosity of someone who had arrived new to a place and meant to understand it properly. She noticed him before she noticed me. This also seems worth noting. On the evening of the fourth day, I was coming through the long gallery when I saw her stop walking and turn to look at Rael, who was keeping pace with her along the far side of the corridor at a distance of perhaps 20 feet. She stood still and watched him for a moment with her head slightly to one side, and then she said, aloud, "I know you're not following me." Rael stopped. "You're going somewhere," she continued thoughtfully, "and it happens to be the same direction." Rael looked at her. She looked at him. Then she said matter-of-factly, "All right then." And she turned and continued her walk. Rael continued his. I stood in the arched doorway at the end of the gallery and watched this exchange, and the coal behind my sternum glowed a shade warmer, which I noted and did not pursue. I made myself known then, because it seemed right to do so rather than stand in the dark of the archway watching. I said, "He's not usually sociable." She turned and looked at me without alarm, which surprised me. Most people, when I appeared unexpectedly in a corridor, had the grace to look at least briefly uncertain. She looked at me the way she had looked at Rael, assessingly, with that same calm tilt of the head. "He's not being sociable," she said. "He's being companionable. They're different things." I considered this. What's the difference? Sociable means wanting something from you. Companionable means being willing to share a silence. She glanced at Rael, who was sitting now, watching both of us with what I had begun to think of as his interested patience. "He seems to prefer the second kind." "He seems to prefer you," I said, and then wished I hadn't said it quite so directly. She considered this without embarrassment. "Maybe," she said, "I don't talk at animals. Some animals don't like being talked at." She paused. "Do you need something, my lord? It's quite late." It was quite late. I was standing in my own gallery, in my own keep at quite a late hour, apparently to be spoken to plainly by a woman who had been here less than a week. I found, peculiarly, that I did not mind this. "No," I said, "nothing. Sleep well." She said good night with the same unhurried evenness she seemed to bring to everything, and continued her walk. Rael stayed where he was, watching her go until she turned the corner at the far end of the gallery, and then turned and looked at me. I said nothing. He said nothing. In his way, we stood together in the empty gallery for a moment, which was perhaps the most honest conversation he and I had had in years. I went back to my chambers by the long way that night, through the west corridor and around the old tower stair, a route that made no particular sense, except that it let me think for longer before I arrived somewhere I was expected to be still. The keep was quiet, the fires in the outer sconces were burning low. I passed the door of the old queen's chamber, which was kept locked and always had been since her death, and I did not pause at it, which was something. For the first several decades, I had paused at it. I had stood outside it for minutes at a time in the late watches of the night, not going in. I never went in, but stopped. The way grief stops you, not because it has anything to say, but because it knows where you are, and does not want you to move too quickly away. I did not pause at it that night. I walked past, and what I noticed was that I had walked past and that the thing behind my sternum was warm enough now that the cold of the locked room did not reach it the way it once had. This did not feel like betrayal. It felt, very quietly, like the beginning of something I was not yet sure I was allowed to have. She did not pursue me. She did not seek me out for conversation, did not engineer further meetings in corridors, did not present herself at the great hall for meals, when she could just as well eat in the kitchen with the household. She was simply present, in the herb room, in the garden, in the long gallery on her evening walks, doing whatever she had come here to do, with a consistency and a quiet that I found, after the first week, oddly steadying. I had grown accustomed, over 100 years, to people who wanted things from me. Pack lords who wanted alliances, council members who wanted decisions, stewards who wanted approval, younger wolves who wanted recognition, Even the people who were kind to me, and there were several, were kind in the way of people who are aware that I am a king, and that the kindness might matter to them someday. I was not resentful of this. It was simply the condition of the life I had. Marin wanted the bone set to be properly dried before it went into the winter stores. She wanted the frost sage cut back along the eastern beds before the first hard freeze, because it would spread its root runners if left undone, and she did not want to spend the spring cutting back root runners if it could be avoided now. She wanted, apparently, a good-sized pot for the evening meal on Thursdays, because she had begun making a broth for the younger wolves in the kennels, who had come down with the coughing sickness that always moved through the pack in early winter, and the pot she'd been given was insufficient. These were the things she wanted. She told Oren about them, and Oren told me, and I authorized what was needed, and she thanked Oren, and that was that. On the 7th day, I crossed paths with her in the kitchen yard when I came through on my way to the gate. She was measuring something into a small clay pot with the focused look of someone doing precise work. She glanced up, registered me, and said good morning, with the tone of someone who greets all people with the same measure of attention, no more and no less. I found this, inexplicably, a relief. For 100 years I had been greeted by my pack with a calibrated care, a note of deference that was reflexive by now, the way of wolves when they are in the presence of their lord. It is not a burdensome thing, that deference, and I did not resent it. But Marin greeting me the way she greeted the stable assistant, with the same unhurried good morning she gave anyone she passed. That was like a door standing open into a room with ordinary air in it, and I had not been in such a room in quite some time. I stopped. I do not know what made me stop, precisely. I said, "How is the broth coming along?" She looked up from the clay pot. "It needs the white root to go in tomorrow," she said, "and another 2 days after that before it's ready for the kennels. But the cough in the 3 youngest is already lighter. I think they'll come through it well." I said, "Good." I meant it simply, and it came out simply, and she nodded and went back to her measuring, and I went on to the gate. That was the whole of it. And yet I found myself some hours later thinking about it, about the particular texture of a conversation in which nothing was wanted and nothing was withheld, in which the subject was 3 young wolves coughing in the kennel and the usefulness of white root, and in which I had been addressed as nothing more remarkable than a person who had asked a reasonable question. I could not have said, precisely, why this stayed with me. I only know that it did. On the 14th evening I found myself in the east wing again, coming through to the corridor that connected to the lower stair. I told myself, though I am less certain now of what I was telling myself, and I heard her from the herb room speaking in that low, unhurried way she had, which was not quite the sound of someone talking to themselves. I stopped outside the door, which was open a handspan. She was talking to Rael. Not the way one talks at animals, the performative cheerfulness some people put on for a creature they want something from. She was talking to him the way she had described, not to get anything from him, but as though he were someone she was willing to share a silence with, and the talking was only the shape that the silence took between them. She was telling him about the valley she had come from, the color of the light in winter there, which was a different quality from the light at Veldmoor. More diffuse, she said, because of the way the surrounding hills softened the sun before it reached the valley floor. She told him about a particular plant that grew along the river there, a variety of bone set with a lavender flower that you did not find anywhere north of the pass, which she missed because it had a specific use for joint pain in older wolves that she had not found an adequate substitute for at Veldmoor. She told him she thought she might try growing it here in a sheltered bed along the south-facing wall, if the winter wasn't too hard. Rael was lying at her feet with his chin on his forepaws. His eyes were open. I stood in the dark of the corridor and listened, and the coal in my chest was a steady, warm thing by now, not a flicker. I left before she could know I had been there, but I walked back to my chambers thinking about lavender bone-set flowers, which was perhaps the strangest thought I had entertained in 100 years, and there was something so absurd and so tender about that strangeness that I sat down at my writing table and could not, for a while, write anything at all. On the 18th day, I sent for her. Not to the great hall, to my study, the smaller, less formal room where I met with the steward and the head keeper and the healers who worked within the keep. I told Oren to ask her to come at her convenience, because I did not want her to feel summoned, and I could already hear what Oren would tell me about himself later, which was that he had never, in 60 years of service, been asked to convey an invitation to the Lord's study with the addendum, "at your convenience." She came in the middle of the afternoon, when she had apparently finished what she was doing in the garden. She sat down across from me, with the straightforwardness of someone who had been places before and was not easily impressed by rooms. I asked her if she was comfortable here, if the workroom suited her, if she had everything she needed. She said she was, and she did, and thank you. I asked about the coughing sickness in the kennels, whether the 3 youngest were improving. She said they were, and told me that she had found a similar preparation worked for the older wolves if caught early enough, and she intended to speak to the pack healer about it, if that was acceptable. I said it was more than acceptable. She nodded once, and that was that. Then I asked how long she intended to stay. She considered this genuinely, which was not what I had expected. Through the winter, she said. Your stores will need restocking in late spring, and I can help with that. After that, I'm not certain. She paused. I don't usually stay long in one place. Why not? She looked at me, the same calm assessment, and beneath it something more considered. Because when you stay long in one place, people begin to want things from you that you didn't offer. I thought about that. What things? Permanence, she said. They begin to treat you as though you've made a promise you haven't made, and then there's no good way to leave without it looking like a breaking. I said, that seems like a reason to avoid connection. She said, it's a reason to be careful about connection. Those aren't the same thing. We sat with that for a moment. I found that I was not uncomfortable in the silence of it. That was also unusual. Most silences in my study had the quality of things waiting to be resolved. This one simply sat there, neither threatening nor empty. You were not what I expected, I said, which was perhaps too honest for a first real conversation. But I had been a king for long enough that I was past performing at things. She said, what did you expect? I'm not certain, I said. Someone more interested in being noticed. She said, I've never found being noticed to be particularly useful. No, I said. I'm beginning to think you're right about that. I looked at her steadily. I notice things differently when I'm not being asked to. Rael chose you, I said. This was not what I had planned to say. He has not chosen anyone in 100 years. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I know. Does that not seem significant to you? She looked at me steadily. It seems significant, she said, but it's his choosing, not mine. A pause. And it's not mine to decide what it means for you. I looked at her across the table. That warmth was a settled, constant thing behind my ribs now. No longer something I could mistake for anything other than what it was. No, I said, that part is mine. She did not look away. She did not lean toward me, or away from me. She simply waited, with the same patience she brought to the herb room, and the garden, and the conversations she had with my wolf in the low light of a stone room, to see what I would say next. I haven't named it, I told her. What it is I'm feeling, I want to be honest with you about that. She said, I appreciate that. But I notice it, I said. Every time you're nearby, it has been present for 18 days, and it does not diminish. It is the opposite of diminishing. She was still for a moment, then she said, what does it feel like? Like a coal that has been sitting in ash for a very long time, I said, and has just been reminded that it is still warm. She was quiet. Something moved across her face. Not the performance of being moved, not careful prettiness, but a genuine thing, small and private. She looked down at her hands for a moment and then back up at me. I felt it too, she said. I didn't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do with it either, I said. I'm telling you that honestly. She almost smiled. I suppose that's a place to start. I would not ask you for anything you haven't offered, I said. I want that to be clear. It's clear, she said. She looked at me for a moment. I'll stay through spring, she said. And we'll see what the spring says. I said, that is enough. And it was. It was more than I had had for 100 years. I should say something about the pack and the winter, because you cannot understand what happened in the Great Hall without knowing both. Veldmore was a highland keep, and highland packs were not gentle about their opinions, particularly not about their lord's private business, when their lord had given them a century of nothing to form opinions about. There were 12 senior wolves on the pack council, old wolves, most of them, who had run the mountain passes with me in the years before I understood what it was to be still. And they had begun, over the course of the winter, to take an interest in Marin's continued presence in the keep. This interest was not hostile, it was watchful. Wolves, when they want to understand something, watch it for a very long time before they reach a conclusion, and what they were watching now was a woman who had arrived with a caravan, had been asked to stay through winter, and whom their lord's spirit wolf, who had not cared, visibly and conclusively, about anything since the death of the first queen, would not leave alone. The 3 eldest wolves on the council, Baron, who was the head elder, Yiels, who had been Veldmore's record-keeper since the founding, and old Dov, who was 120 and who had been my father's wolf second before my father died, had begun attending the morning hour in the great hall with more frequency than usual. They were not subtle about it. They would settle themselves at the long table, pour their cups, and watch the corridor that led from the east wing with an attention that was only slightly short of standing up and pointing. I was not unaware of this. I said nothing about it to them, and they said nothing about it to me. Because the code of Veldmore was that the Lord's personal affairs remained the Lord's personal affairs until the pack had a reason to speak, and they did not yet have a reason. They had a suspicion and a great deal of accumulated hope, but hope is not a reason, and they were old enough to know that. On the 33rd morning, they got their reason. It was not planned. I want to be clear about that as well. I did not engineer it as a demonstration for the council, and neither did she. What happened was this. I came through the great hall at the morning hour and found Baron, Eels, and old Dove already at the table, as they had been every morning for the past 2 weeks, with their cups and their careful neutral faces. Marin was already there as well, at the far end of the hall, speaking to one of the kitchen assistants about something. I could not hear the words from across the hall, but there was a basket of herb bundles on the table beside her, and I supposed it had something to do with the Thursday broth. And Rael was beside her. He had been at her heels since the beginning of the morning, as he often was now. He came with her to the garden, came with her to the herb room, came with her through the corridors of the keep. The pack had seen this every day for more than a month. It had been remarked upon extensively and then settled into the category of known things. What had not happened before was what happened now. Oren was near the door. He had just come into the hall with a packet of correspondence from the outer gate. He stopped when he saw the room's configuration, the 3 old wolves at the table, Marin at the far end, me near the fire. And then, with the composure of a man who had seen 60 years of the unlikely, he set the correspondence on the side table and stayed where he was. "Rael," I said. The sound carried in the hall. The 3 wolves at the table looked up. Rael, at the far end of the hall, turned his head toward me. "Come," I said. In 100 years, I had not given him that command in front of witnesses. I had given it in corridors, in the yard, in the gallery, always alone or nearly so. I did not know, precisely, why I gave it now, in front of the 3 eldest wolves of my council. Perhaps I had been carrying the question long enough that some part of me wanted it answered publicly. Perhaps I simply could not help myself. Rael looked at me. He stood up. I felt something lift in my chest, the possibility that this would be simple, that he would simply come, and the question would be answered in the uncomplicated way. He walked 4 paces toward me and stopped. Then he turned around, walked back to where Marin stood, and lay down across her feet. The hall was entirely silent. Marin looked down at him with the expression of someone who is genuinely uncertain whether they are supposed to apologize for something. Then she looked at me, and whatever she saw in my face made her not apologize. "Come," I said again, quietly. Rael did not move, but he turned his great silver-black head and looked at me, directly, as he had always looked at me, with that mildly tolerant awareness of my existence. And then, slowly and deliberately, he turned his head to look at Marin, and then back to me. In 60 years of service, Oren later told me, he had seen a great many things. He had not seen a spirit wolf make an argument before. But that is what it was. That is the only word for it. Rael was not simply refusing a command. He was making a point. He was looking at her and looking at me and looking at her, with the patience of an animal that has been waiting 100 years for someone to understand what he understood, and has finally found an occasion specific enough to make the understanding unavoidable. Old Dove, at the table, set down his cup. He had been a wolf second at Veldmore since before I was born, and he knew every weight a silence could carry. He knew the weight of that particular silence better than almost anyone alive, because he had been in the great hall the morning 100 years ago, when Rael had lain down at the feet of my first queen, as she lay still, and had not moved for 6 days, and when he had finally risen, had looked at the hall with exactly this quality of expression, the look of a wolf who has decided that the world contains one fewer thing worth answering to, and is settling in for as long as that remains true. Dove had not seen that look on Rael's face reversed before. He had not thought to see it reversed. And now he was watching Rael look between me and a woman with a basket of herb bundles at the far end of the hall, and the look on the wolf's face was not the look of indifference that had worn 100 years' worth of grooves into the keep's memory. It was its opposite, attention, intention, the specific brightness of a creature that has found the thing it was waiting for. Dove looked at Rael, he looked at Marin, he looked at me. Then he reached out and put his hand, very quietly, on the arm of old Baran beside him. Baran looked up, he followed Dove's gaze. He was still for a moment, and then, with the measured gravity of a wolf elder who has waited 100 years to see something, and will not waste the seeing of it, he folded his hands on the table and was silent. Yils, beside him, had already seen. Isles, who had been Veldmore's record-keeper since the founding of the keep and who had written down the name of every wolf who had ever mattered in this hall, was looking at Rael with the expression of someone who is composing a sentence in their mind and wants to be sure to get it right. For a moment the 3 eldest wolves of my council were as still as the hall itself. "My lord," old Dov said. His voice was entirely even. "I believe your wolf has something to say." I looked at Rael, who was still watching me with that particular patient look. "Yes," I said. "I believe he does." I sent everyone out of the hall. Not rudely. I told Oren to see to the morning work, told the kitchen assistant to attend to whatever needed attending to in the kitchen, looked at old Dove and Baron and Eels with the expression I used when I meant something clearly and without elaboration. They rose. Dove glanced once more at Rael and then at me, and gave a very small nod before he went out. The hall was empty except for the 3 of us. Rael, at her feet. Marin, standing at the far end of the room with her basket of herb bundles, and a look that was careful and steady, and something else I had not seen on her face before. And me, standing near the fire. I walked the length of the hall. She watched me come. She did not move. When I stopped a few feet from her, close enough to speak without raising my voice, she lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance. She was too honest for performances of defiance, but in the simple acknowledgement that she was here, and she was present, and whatever I said next, she would hear it. "I owe you an explanation," I said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "He's your wolf. You were giving him a command." "The command failed," I said. "Yes," she agreed. "It did." "It failed," I said, "because he already knows what I have not yet said to you plainly." I looked at her. "He knows you are my fated mate." The words sat in the air between us. Marin did not move immediately. She looked at me with those steady, considering eyes, and I watched her take in what I had said, not with the performative astonishment of someone who has been waiting to hear it, and not with the retreat of someone who hadn't expected it and wants to run, but with the honest slowness of a person receiving information that is large and needs to be held carefully. She looked down at Rael. He was looking up at her. "He knew before you did," she said. "Yes." "How long has he known?" "I believe," I said, "since the day you came through the gate." She was quiet. "That's 33 days. "Yes." She breathed in through her nose, slowly. "And how long have you known?" "I have," I said, choosing the words carefully, "been aware of something since the 18th day, when I told you about the coal. I have been certain since the morning I stood in the corridor outside your workroom and heard you speaking to him about lavender boneset." She looked at me for a moment. "You heard that?" "I did. I am sorry I didn't make myself known." She shook her head slightly. "I don't mind that you heard." She paused. I didn't know who I was talking to exactly. When I talked to him. Another pause. "I think I might have known. A little." Rael put his chin back on his forepaws. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to hear it as a question, not as a claim." She nodded. "You told me," I said, "that you don't usually stay long in one place, because people begin to want things from you that you haven't offered." I looked at her steadily. "I am not asking for anything you haven't offered. I would not do that. But I am asking whether you are willing to stay here long enough to know whether this, what is between us, is what Rael and I both believe it is. No more than that. Stay and know." She was quiet for a moment. "You're giving me a choice," she said. "I am giving you a choice," I said. "There is no other way I would want this." She looked at Rael again. He was watching her, and his ears were in that alert, interested position, the position I had only ever seen since she arrived. "He's been waiting for you," I said. "For something that would matter again. I think we both have been." Her face was doing that small, private thing again, the genuine movement beneath the composed surface, the thing she did not perform. She looked away from me for a moment, toward the high, narrow windows of the hall, and the winter light came in gray and thin across the stone floor, and when she looked back at me, her eyes were clear. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." The winter moon rose 20 days later. It was the deep of the year, the longest night, the coldest, the one the pack marked with fires along the ridge above the keep, so that the whole eastern face of Veldmore was lit from below in amber and smoke. It was the night we brought in the last of the winter stores. It was the night the pack gathered in the great hall, and the elder wolves told the old stories, the ones that went back to before the keep had walls, when Veldmore was only a mountain and a bloodline, and the understanding that certain wolves were bound to it. Marin stood beside me in the great hall. She had not been told to stand there. She had arrived at the hall that evening with Rael at her side, and she had walked to where I stood near the head of the long table, and she had simply stood beside me, with the same unhurried directness she brought to everything. Old Dove had looked. Old Yills had looked. Old Baron, who was not given to expression, had permitted himself something that came very close to satisfaction. I did not say anything about it, neither did she, She watched the hall with the same calm attention she brought to a garden bed in winter, noticing what was there, taking it in without trying to change it. And when old Dov began to speak, the formal words, the ones that named the winter moon and what it was for, the bonding of wolves under the longest dark, she did not look at me. She looked straight ahead, at the hall and the fires and the faces of the pack. But her hand moved slightly at her side, and my hand moved slightly at mine, and they came together, unhurried, the way she did everything. Rael, at our feet, lifted his head. The warmth behind my sternum was not a coal anymore. It was not a flicker, not a remembrance of warmth, not the ghost of something that had once burned and had been sitting 100 years in ash. It was a fire, and it was lit, and it was mine, and it was hers, and it had been waiting in the dark for exactly this long, for exactly this reason, for exactly the woman who had walked through my gate with a flat wooden case on her back, and a bundle of herb branches under one arm, and the kind of unhurried patience that does not try to be noticed and therefore cannot be missed. When the old words were done, and the hall began to ease, and the fires on the ridge blazed up orange against the black winter sky, I leaned toward her and said, quietly, so that only she could hear me, "You are staying past spring." She looked at me. Not a question in her face, a consideration. Then she said, "I know." I said, "Is that all right?" She looked down at Rael, who was watching both of us with the patient, satisfied attention of an animal that has been proved right about something and is in no hurry at all about it. "Ask me again in spring," she said, "just to be formal about it." "I will," I said. "Then yes," she said. "That is all right." Rael put his chin on his forepaws and closed his eyes. I had spent 100 years learning what it was to govern a kingdom from behind the wall of private grief, to do the work well, to serve the pack faithfully, to be what I was supposed to be, and to keep a certain room inside myself locked and dark because I did not know how to inhabit it without her, without the queen I had lost, without the mate the bond had given me once and I could not believe it would give me again. What I had not known, what I had needed a wolf to show me, with the particular stubbornness of a creature that has been patient for a very long time and has finally run out of patience, was that the room had not been dark. It had been warm. It had been warm the whole time, waiting in the same way that a coal waits in ash, not gone, not finished, not extinguished, but banked against the long cold, holding its heat through the winter, ready to give light and warmth the moment someone put a careful hand near enough to feel it. Her hand was in mine. Rael was asleep at our feet. Outside, the pack's fires burned against the dark. That is the whole of the story. That is how a great wolf who had not obeyed a single command in 100 years finally gave his answer. Not with obedience, but with something better, with the choosing of a place to lie down, and the refusal to move from it, and the turning of a great silver-black head between a man who was only beginning to understand and a woman who was waiting, with the steadiness of someone who had always known how to share a silence, to see if he would.